Plans for the Northern Gateway pipeline have been in development for over a decade, and not surprisingly, the majority of the media coverage associated with the proposed infrastructure is completely negative. The project that would extend from Bruderheim, Alberta to Kitimat, British Columbia would include twin pipelines, one carrying bitumen to the west for export by tanker and the other carrying condensate to the east. But there are many obstacles to overcome, and in many ways, the chances of actually constructing the pipeline are looking pretty slim right now, even though the project was approved by the National Energy Board, or NEB, under the Conservative government with 209 conditions. The main issues involve consultations with First Nations and Métis groups, opposition from the federal government and their attempt to impose a tanker ban, and also opposition from the provincial government and environmental groups. There have been several court battles surrounding the project, which are ongoing and have been brought forth by First Nations and Métis groups. The Supreme Court of British Columbia ruled that the provincial government failed in their obligations to coastal First Nations groups. And just recently, the Federal Court of Appeals overturned the NEB's approval of Northern Gateway. I mentioned that the majority of the mainstream media attention surrounding this project is entirely negative, and it mostly centers around First Nations groups that oppose the project. But is this true? I decided to do some fact-checking, and here's what I found. The majority of First Nations and Métis groups that were imperative in the consultation support the construction of the Northern Gateway pipeline. There are a total of 45 groups that would be directly affected by the pipeline. These groups went through a learning process that included how the pipeline would be built, what economic and other benefits the communities would receive, and environmental protection. These groups were also offered 10% ownership of Northern Gateway, which means that they have a say in how it's built. And on top of that, the project would add business opportunities and jobs to communities. As it stands, oil is now being transported by rail, which is less safe than pipeline transport, and there are no economic benefits to communities at this time. Out of the 45 groups, 28 have signed on in support, and another 3 are expected to in the near future, leaving only 14 in opposition. That's less than 1/3. Those in support of Northern Gateway form a group called the Aboriginal Equity Partners, and they find the misconceptions about the pipeline alarming. They say that contrary to loud opposition from other Aboriginal groups, there isn't unanimous support for a tanker ban, and First Nations and Métis communities don't unanimously oppose Northern Gateway. Another interesting point that the pro-pipeline group mentions is that consultation on a tanker ban needs to take place under Section 35 of the Constitutional Act of 1982. Justin Trudeau has promised to make a tanker ban happen, and he has voiced his clear opposition to the project, citing rainforest destruction. In fact, he made a moratorium on tankers an election promise and instructed Marc Garneau, Minister of Transport, to do the research and make it happen, without consulting all of the affected groups. Aboriginal Equity Partners say that their communities will lose $1 billion in long-term economic and educational benefits. They'll miss out on critical infrastructure and prosperity for future generations if a tanker ban is imposed. I mentioned that just last week, the Federal Court of Appeals overturned the NEB's approval for Northern Gateway, and it was due to the previous Conservative government's lack of consultation with Indigenous communities, even though a potential 31 communities are on board. And now the Liberals are failing to consult First Nations and Métis groups on a tanker ban. Talk about calling the kettle black. So much for sunny ways, inclusion, and transparency. For the Rebel.media, I'm Holly Nicholas.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.